The morning frost still clung to the Pennsylvania countryside when 8-year-old Tommy Brennan spotted something white gleaming beneath a pile of autumn leaves on November 7, 1982. The small farming community of Cedar Valley, nestled between rolling hills and dense patches of pine forest, had experienced its first hard freeze the night before. Tommy was collecting firewood with his older brother near the abandoned Miller farmstead when his boot kicked against what he initially thought was a broken piece of pottery. What Tommy had discovered would launch one of Pennsylvania's most perplexing cold cases, a mystery that would consume investigators for over 4 decades, destroy careers, and leave a family forever searching for answers about their missing daughter. The bone fragment, no larger than a silver dollar, belonged to 19-year-old Rebecca Walsh, a nursing student who had vanished without explanation from her dormitory at Cedar Valley Community College exactly 13 months earlier. Rebecca's disappearance had already baffled local law enforcement. On the evening of October 15, 1981, she had returned to her dormitory room after studying late in the library, said goodnight to her roommate, Jennifer Hayes, and locked her door from the inside. When Jennifer woke the next morning, Rebecca's bed appeared slept in, but Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Her books remained stacked neatly on her desk, her clothes hung undisturbed in the closet, and her purse sat untouched on the nightstand containing $47 in cash and her student identification card. The discovery of Rebecca's bone fragment transformed what had been classified as a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Detective Frank Morrison, a 23-year veteran of the Cedar Valley Police Department, had worked the original disappearance with the methodical persistence of someone accustomed to small-town crimes that usually resolved themselves within days. Young women didn't simply vanish from locked dormitory rooms in communities where everyone knew their neighbors, and the most serious crime of the previous decade had been a string of mailbox vandalisms. Morrison approached the bone fragment case with renewed determination, but the forensic capabilities of 1982 Pennsylvania proved frustratingly limited. The fragment underwent basic analysis at the state laboratory, confirming it belonged to a female between the ages of 18 and 25. But DNA profiling technology that could definitively link the remains to Rebecca wouldn't exist for another decade. The bone showed evidence of trauma consistent with blunt force impact, suggesting Rebecca had suffered a violent death. But the fragment's deteriorated condition made it impossible to determine specific details about the weapon or circumstances of the attack. The investigation expanded to encompass a 5-mile radius around the Miller farmstead, where search teams equipped with metal detectors and trained dogs combed through acres of overgrown fields and abandoned outbuildings. The Miller property had been vacant since 1978, when old Henry Miller died and his children moved to Philadelphia, leaving behind a 2-story farmhouse that had become a popular destination for local teenagers seeking privacy and adventure. Morrison's systematic approach to the case revealed disturbing patterns that hadn't been apparent during the original missing person investigation. Rebecca Walsh wasn't the only young woman who had disappeared from Cedar Valley during the early 1980s. 3 other female students had vanished from the community college over a span of 18 months, though their cases had been handled by different jurisdictions and never connected. Sarah Chen, 20, had disappeared from her off-campus apartment in March 1981. Lisa Rodriguez, 19, had last been seen leaving her job at a local restaurant in August 1981. Karen Thompson, 21, had vanished from a campus parking lot in December 1981, just 2 months after Rebecca's disappearance. The detectives' investigation into these connected disappearances revealed a community that had been living in denial about a predator operating in their midst. Each case had been treated as an isolated incident. Young women making poor decisions, running away from academic pressure, or leaving town with boyfriends their families hadn't met. The bone fragment discovery forced Morrison and other investigators to confront the uncomfortable reality that someone had been systematically targeting female college students for nearly 2 years. Morrison's background check of individuals with access to the Miller farmstead produced a list of 43 potential suspects, including former employees, neighbors, delivery personnel, and local teenagers who had used the abandoned property for parties. The detective methodically interviewed each person, looking for connections to the missing women and alibis for the relevant time periods. Most proved to have solid explanations for their presence at the farmstead and no apparent links to the victims. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Morrison discovered that the Miller property's caretaker, a quiet man named David Kellner, who had been responsible for periodic maintenance checks since Henry Miller's death, had failed to mention his regular visits to the farmstead during initial questioning. Kellner, a 42-year-old handyman who lived alone in a trailer park outside Cedar Valley, had been checking the Miller property monthly for the past 4 years, ensuring the house remained secure and reporting any damage to the Miller family's lawyer in Philadelphia. Morrison's deeper investigation into Kellner's background revealed a troubling history that had somehow escaped detection during the original interviews. Kellner had been questioned by police in 3 separate incidents involving young women between 1975 and 1980, twice for following female joggers in his pickup truck and once for loitering outside a women's dormitory at a different college. In each case, Kellner had provided explanations that satisfied investigating officers, and no charges had been filed. The detective's examination of Kellner's work schedule showed that he had been present at or near the Miller farmstead during time periods that coincided with 3 of the 4 disappearances. Kellner claimed his visits were routine maintenance checks, but Morrison noticed that his documented visits to the property had increased dramatically in frequency during 1981 and early 1982, from monthly inspections to weekly trips that he justified as necessary due to vandalism concerns. Morrison's investigation revealed that Kellner possessed detailed knowledge of the Miller farmstead's layout, including outbuildings and root cellars that weren't visible from the main road. The property's isolated location, combined with Kellner's legitimate access and familiarity with the terrain, made it an ideal location for concealing evidence or disposing of remains. More disturbing still, Morrison discovered that Kellner had been present at the farmstead on October 16, 1981, the day after Rebecca Walsh's disappearance, supposedly conducting an unscheduled inspection that he claimed was prompted by reports of suspicious activity from neighbors. The detective's case against Kellner remained largely circumstantial, despite these troubling connections. The bone fragment provided evidence of Rebecca's death, but couldn't directly link Kellner to her murder. The other 3 missing women hadn't been found, leaving investigators without physical evidence to support homicide charges. Kellner maintained his innocence throughout repeated interviews, insisting that his presence at the Miller farmstead was purely professional and that he had no knowledge of any criminal activity on the property. Morrison spent months building his case, working 18-hour days and sacrificing his personal relationships to pursue justice for Rebecca Walsh and the other missing women. The detective's obsession with solving the case began affecting his judgment and his health, as colleagues watched him transform from a methodical investigator into someone consumed by theories that grew increasingly complex and speculative. The case reached a crucial juncture in the spring of 1983, when Morrison believed he had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to convince the district attorney to file charges against Kellner. The detective had documented Kellner's suspicious behavior, established his presence near the crime scenes, and uncovered his history of concerning encounters with young women. But the prosecutor, mindful of the challenges involved in securing a conviction based primarily on circumstantial evidence, decided that the case wasn't strong enough to proceed to trial. The decision devastated Morrison and left the families of the missing women feeling abandoned by a justice system that seemed unwilling to take risks on their behalf. The detective's faith in his abilities and his department began to crumble as he watched Kellner continue living freely in the community, while 4 families remained without answers about their daughters' fates. Morrison's frustration deepened as the months stretched into years without resolution. The detective found himself returning repeatedly to the Miller farmstead, walking the same paths where Rebecca's bone fragment had been discovered, hoping that the landscape might reveal secrets it had kept buried for decades. The property became a pilgrimage site of sorts for Morrison, who would arrive before dawn to search areas that had been combed through dozens of times before, driven by an obsession that his colleagues began to view with growing concern. The investigation's impact on Cedar Valley Community College proved devastating for enrollment and community trust. Parents throughout Pennsylvania began questioning the safety of small rural colleges, and Cedar Valley's student body dwindled as families chose institutions in larger cities with more robust security systems. The college administration implemented new safety protocols, mandatory check-ins for dormitory residents, enhanced lighting throughout campus, and security patrols that operated around the clock. But these measures felt inadequate against an unknown predator who had already demonstrated the ability to make young women disappear without leaving traces. Rebecca's parents, Margaret and Robert Walsh, became fixtures at the Cedar Valley Police Department, arriving every Tuesday morning to meet with Morrison and review any developments in their daughter's case. Margaret carried a manila folder containing Rebecca's school photographs, letters she had written home, and newspaper clippings about the investigation. The folder grew thicker over the years, as the family collected every piece of information related to their daughter's disappearance, creating their own investigative archive that rivaled the official police files. The psychological toll on the Walsh family manifested in different ways as the investigation stalled. Robert, a machinist at a local manufacturing plant, threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, volunteering for overtime shifts that kept him away from home and the constant reminders of Rebecca's absence. Margaret developed an encyclopedic knowledge of missing person cases throughout Pennsylvania, corresponding with other families who had lost daughters under similar circumstances, searching for patterns that law enforcement might have overlooked. David Kellner's life in Cedar Valley became increasingly uncomfortable as suspicion followed him through grocery stores, church services, and social gatherings where conversations would pause when he approached. Though never formally charged, Kellner found himself ostracized by a community that had concluded he was responsible for Rebecca's death and the disappearances of the other young women. His work as a handyman dried up as former clients found reasons to terminate his services, and he was eventually forced to leave Cedar Valley in search of employment opportunities that weren't tainted by whispered accusations. The departure of their primary suspect left Morrison without a clear focus for his investigation, but it didn't diminish his determination to solve Rebecca's case. The detective began expanding his research to include similar disappearances throughout rural Pennsylvania, looking for evidence of a serial predator who might have been operating across multiple jurisdictions. His efforts revealed disturbing patterns. Young women vanishing from small college towns, abandoned properties serving as disposal sites, and investigations that stalled due to limited additional complications, resources, and jurors. Morrison's superiors grew increasingly concerned about his mental state, as the detective's pursuit of Rebecca's killer began consuming all aspects of his professional and personal life. His marriage to Linda, an elementary school teacher, deteriorated under the strain of his obsession, as Morrison spent evenings and weekends pursuing theories that grew more elaborate and less grounded in evidence. Linda Morrison filed for divorce in 1985, citing irreconcilable differences, but privately telling friends that her husband had become a stranger who cared more about dead girls than his living family. The technological limitations of 1980s forensic science proved to be the investigation's greatest obstacle. The bone fragment that had launched the homicide case contained genetic material that wouldn't become analyzable for another decade, when DNA profiling techniques advanced sufficiently to extract usable samples from degraded remains. Morrison watched helplessly as other cases were solved using fingerprint analysis, witness testimony, and physical evidence that Rebecca's case lacked entirely. The detective's breakthrough came in an unexpected form during the winter of 1987, when construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping center discovered additional human remains buried beneath what had once been the Miller farmstead's vegetable garden. The skeletal remains, more complete than the original bone fragment, belonged to a young female who had been deceased for several years. Forensic examination revealed trauma patterns consistent with the bone fragment found 5 years earlier, suggesting that multiple victims had been disposed of on the Miller property. The discovery of the second set of remains revitalized the investigation and provided Morrison with physical evidence that supported his theories about a serial predator operating in Cedar Valley. The remains underwent the most sophisticated forensic analysis available in 1987, including facial reconstruction techniques that might allow for victim identification and ballistics examination of metallic fragments found near the bones. Morrison's investigation of the newly discovered remains revealed that they belonged to Lisa Rodriguez, the 19-year-old restaurant worker who had disappeared in August 1981. The confirmation that at least 2 of the missing women had been murdered and buried at the Miller farmstead provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to reopen the case against David Kellner, who had relocated to western Pennsylvania and found work as a maintenance supervisor at a small manufacturing company. The detectives' efforts to locate Kellner proved more challenging than expected, as their primary suspect had deliberately obscured his trail after leaving Cedar Valley. Kellner had changed his name, obtained new identification documents, and created a false employment history that made him difficult to trace through conventional investigative methods. Morrison spent months working with law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania to track Kellner's movements and establish his current whereabouts. The investigation's renewed momentum attracted attention from state and federal law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring similar cases throughout the region. The Pennsylvania State Police assigned additional investigators to assist Morrison, bringing resources and expertise that the small Cedar Valley Department had lacked during the initial investigation. Federal Bureau of Investigation profilers analyzed the crime scenes and victim patterns, providing psychological insights into the perpetrator's behavior and motivations. The collaborative investigation revealed connections between Rebecca's case and unsolved disappearances in neighboring states, suggesting that the predator responsible for the Cedar Valley murders had been operating across a much wider geographic area than originally suspected. Young women had vanished from college towns in Ohio, West Virginia, and Maryland during time periods that coincided with gaps in Kellner's known whereabouts, creating a pattern of predatory behavior that had escaped detection due to poor communication between jurisdictions. Morrison's pursuit of justice for Rebecca Walsh had evolved from a local missing person case into a multi-state investigation involving dozens of law enforcement agencies and potentially dozens of victims. The detective who had started his career handling small-town crimes found himself at the center of one of Pennsylvania's most complex serial murder investigations, carrying the weight of families who had waited years for answers about their missing daughters. The case that had begun with a child's discovery of a bone fragment in autumn leaves had grown into something far more sinister than anyone in Cedar Valley could have imagined. Rebecca Walsh's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a systematic pattern of predation that had claimed young lives across multiple states for years. Morrison's obsessive pursuit of her killer had revealed a truth that was both validating and terrifying. Rebecca had died at the hands of someone who had perfected the art of making young women disappear. The breakthrough that had eluded Detective Morrison for over 40 years finally arrived in March 2024, when advanced DNA extraction techniques successfully isolated genetic material from both sets of remains discovered at the Miller farmstead. The profile matched samples collected from David Kellner's former residence, definitively linking him to Rebecca Walsh and Lisa Rodriguez's murders. Though Kellner had died in prison in 2019 while serving time for an unrelated assault charge, the DNA evidence provided the closure that four families had desperately sought for decades. Margaret Walsh, now 83 and confined to a wheelchair, wept when investigators informed her that science had finally identified her daughter's killer. The manila folder she had carried to countless police meetings could finally be closed, its contents serving as a testament to a mother's unwavering love and determination. Rebecca's case became a cornerstone example of how persistence, technological advancement, and collaborative investigation could bring justice even when hope seemed lost. The Miller farmstead, long since developed into the shopping center where the second set of remains was discovered, now bears a small memorial plaque honoring Rebecca Walsh and the other young women whose lives were cut short by a predator who believed he could escape justice forever. Sometimes the truth takes decades to surface, but it never truly disappears, waiting patiently beneath the autumn leaves for someone brave enough to keep searching.